Hello, my friends, and thank you for listening to today's episode of Euripides, Eumenides, a theater history podcast. And that thank you is sincere. At this point, we've recorded 20 episodes, and much more is planned. And your continued listening is beyond appreciated. So please feel free to write a review where you get this podcast, as it really helps grow the audience and helps me and allows me to keep bringing this weird and wacky take on theater history to you twice a month. Now, I'm still relatively new to the podcasting game, but I've already been able to network with some amazing people in this trade. So I want to share with you some picks for great podcasts and their hosts who I have been able to connect with, because if you like this show, you should enjoy theirs as well. The first takes a very academic and chronological look at the history of European theater. In fact, that's the name of the show, The History of European Theater. For each episode, host Philip Rowe deeply explores a facet of European theater in succession. Starting with the meaning of theater in the Western world, Philip has a multitude of episodes that begin with the Greek theater and has made his way up to the medieval era. In fact, the episode discussing the Satyr play was used as a reference from my 12th episode titled The Rites of Dionysus. Each of Philip's episodes is only about a half hour long, and trust me, you'll feel a lot smarter about theater after listening to just one. The History of European Theater. You'll find that on all major podcast providers, but I'll also leave a link to the show's website in the summary of this episode. Next is an approach to history similar to my own, the podcast History Defeats Itself. For each episode, a trio of friends get together. One of them is assigned to research and present a topic to ask the age-old question, is history doomed to repeat itself? The other two hosts are completely left in the dark about the topic until they record, very similar to the format of Euripides, Eumenides. Often, the concepts are approached with apprehensive humor and not so much a fatalist attitude as the title suggests, but rather a glimmer of hope that humanity actually might still be evolving. I particularly recommend the episode regarding the names of American sports teams and their mascots, which in recent years has become quite a topic of discussion, especially considering the often negative depiction of indigenous peoples in America. Always funny and always poignant, History Defeats Itself is a great listen, and I'll leave a link to their website in this episode's description as well. Now, if you followed this show at all, you know that I have just completed directing a truly phenomenal production of the Rocky Horror Picture Show. The cast and audience had a beautifully sexy time at the theater, and we plan to get the production repeated on an annual basis. However, for this podcast, that production took up a lot of my time in the past few weeks, so I didn't have a lot of time to get a new episode ready for you. Fortunately, I recently became friends with producer Richard Jordan, who is an absolute fountain of knowledge about what makes a show in today's theater work and why they might not be so successful sometimes. Richard and I recorded episodes 9 and 10, in which we dissected the Broadway run of Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark, but oftentimes our conversation delved into other topics. Most of that content didn't make it into the episodes, but is still incredibly valuable content regarding the success of plays and musicals in the Western world. So today, I give you something of a Frankenstein's monster, sewn from the discarded parts of a fascinating conversation. Please enjoy this mishmash of a mini-sode, and we'll be back to you with some new content in a couple of weeks. Thanks. My deep appreciation of theater history was instilled in me by Tom Empey, a college mentor to me and hundreds of others. While teaching Greek theater terms, he would grab the fabric of his slacks and say, "You see these pants? Euripides, Eumenides," making light of content that could be considered rather dry and stuffy, while still maintaining respect for the art, which is what I want to do with this podcast. For each episode, I invite a guest from the many paths my theater career has taken me down. I give my guests no idea what we'll be talking about, but they know we're going to find an outrageous story about theater history and perhaps get a better understanding about why we're still doing it after all these years. So welcome to Euripides, Eumenides, and I am your host, Aaron Odom.
Apocalypse, apocalypse, I said, why you wanna show up now? Just when the heart of my life was getting good. I'll give you one more chance. Walk on out of the door, yeah. Get your ass to getting where the getting is good.
The next thing, of course, they come back to, which of course brings us back into a Spider-Man situation, is when they have the idea of bringing Judy Taymor on and creating something that's extraordinary with The Lion King.
Right.
Now, The Lion King is also interesting because, of course, it creates animals on stage, something that audiences are amazed by through her paperwork and her designs and her puppetry. But you actually have to also flip back there to 1991 and to look also at what was going on in the West End at that moment, where John Napier, the extraordinary designer of musicals in the 80s, such as Cats, Miss Saigon, Les Miserables, created a show called Children of Eden. And Children of Eden, the design of that show, which opened at the Prince Edward Theatre, Stephen Schwartz's musical that was following on, obviously, from Godspell and all those others. This was his big musical he was making with John Caird. John Caird, the co-director of Les Miserables, original director of the Don Black and Forever musical Song and Dance. And this was Schwartz's huge musical. And actually, it opens at, it's an example of like It's a Bird, It's a Plane, Spider-Man. It opens at the wrong point because it perhaps opened at the same time as all those superstars and all those big 80s West End musical. It could well have been a hit because it was a pretty extraordinary musical. It was, the set of it was built into this huge concave, so it looked like it was a broken inside of the earth. So it's like you were looking through stained glass going outwards of it. But into that, if you know that musical, the second half is the story of Noah. And into that, John Napier does these extraordinary animal designs in which actors start playing with clever puppetry and stuff, elephants and different.
Are you kidding me?
And it's fascinating when you look at that and go on and look at the pictures, because it's also interesting that was being done on the stage in 91, because it opened and it only ran for less than 3 months, partly because of the first Iraq war that happened.
Oh, right.
Caused its closure, and a lot of other things. It was meant to be the Royal Shakespeare Company. Royal Shakespeare who went to produce it. It was meant to be their next musical after Carrie, but because Carrie didn't go so well for them, musical theatre got kind of abandoned. So the show then got picked up by a commercial company to produce it, and it was just a litany of different problems. That musical features, if you listen to the original score, which is an album which is now quite rare to find, because Ken Page, the great Broadway actor, came over to play God in that show. It had many actors like Ruthie Henschel in it, Ray Shell, actors who in the British musical theatre scene went on to become massive musical theatre stars. One of the greatest ensembles of all time. And it's a phenomenal score, Children of Eden, which is really greatly overlooked. And I think Schwartz is very interesting because Schwartz is, just as a separate note, as a composer, I think has a versatility that's unique in that you've got Godspell, you've got Wicked, you've got The Baker's Wife, you've got Shukanada, this wonderful Viennese musical he's just done. There's very few composers who have such a breadth of writing. But in Children of Eden, I think there is something quite extraordinary about that musical and the influences of that, particularly in design. I just wonder, and I would never know the answer, I just wonder if Judy Taymor ever saw those pictures or indeed was doing something in her own way at that point. But actually, there's a lot of the animal designs and drawings, how he emulates that on stage is actually fascinating to see how a long time later, then Broadway, of course, creates its. Maybe some Disney executives saw it. You never know.
You never know. And yes.
But the influence
that could be
of
interesting. That's interesting. Okay.
Certainly serves something in another way. And certainly, undisputed, what Taymor does with her designs creates an artistic fusion on Broadway of the movie and the musical in a way that's not being done in another way. It's what makes Lion King a groundbreaking show when she comes out with that design.
Absolutely.
And actually, therefore, when Spider-Man comes along, sometime later, it's understandable why people would say, well, if we need to come and reinvent this, what a person that we need to turn and talk about doing it.
Right.
But don't forget, they're also ultimately on this great strive, because what they have now is the fact that they are making a commercial musical. So Hedwig begins from its seat. Look at Rocky Horror. It begins in its seats upstairs at the Royal Court Theatre in 120 seats. Right. And it takes several stages to become a hit. People look at Rocky Horror now, the global franchise that it is, and say, wow, that's a hit commercial musical. What people do not think about with Rocky Horror, and it's a really important thing, is that when that show opened in the 70s, it began in a studio theatre. It then moved to an old cinema on the King's Road in London, where it played for a few years, and it positioned itself in a certain way, and it gained an audience. Then it moved into the West End, and it came to the Comedy Theatre in the West End and played there then for a number of years. What people also forget about Rocky Horror is, of course, we all remember now that when we go and see it, the fun of dressing up and the yelling of all the lines. You have to remember, and this is a really important, that did not start until the movie.
Right.
So that stuff, the show had been in existence before all of that happened. The reason it began in the movie is because the movie came out, and the movie was actually quite a disaster. I mean, Rocky Horror firstly had flopped off Broadway in the US. It had not found a market. When Lou Adler and Michael White produced that show over there, it was a disaster. It came and it went. So what happened then was the movie came along. The movie actually was a pretty unsuccessful movie.
Right.
It didn't get the showing that it should do. But then one night, and in these great moments of history and a bit of luck, it got shown as a late night movie downtown in New York. And in the audience, there was a man sitting there called Sal Paro. Okay. And Sal Paro watched this late night, midnight showing and thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. And if I remember correctly, he begged the movie company to show it again the following week with the promise he would bring some more of his friends to see it. So he brought a group of his friends to see that movie the following week, and they, like him, thought it was the funniest thing they ever saw. And they begged the movie house in that downtown New York City to show it again the next week. And they did, and they brought some more friends. And slowly they started yelling things out at the screen as the show was going forwards.
Oh my God, that's
how Rocky Horror became a cult. Sal Paro became, I think he's still alive, but he became the president of the Rocky Horror Show Worldwide Fan Club.
Oh,
because
perfect.
of that one man happening to be at that cinema at that point, seeing that film, it changed the fortunes of a movie that probably otherwise would have just gone into the trash can and sat as a sort of strange cult classic that might have appeared occasionally.
Right.
And you have to remember that the journey, if you're trying to emulate Rocky Horror and that young audience and how it became hip and cool, it began in a way, in a really specific way, closer to that situation. And another good example, but a very important lesson that actually could have been learnt for Spider-Man, is to look at the Boy George musical Taboo. Now,
I forgot about that.
Now, Taboo is a show that began in the early 2000s at a venue in London called The Venue, small 300-seat theatre. Score written by Boy George. It's a fantastic score. If you've not heard it, if people are listening, listen to the London cast recording. Don't listen to what happened when they did it as a Broadway recording. Because it ran for a couple of years in London. And then it came along with the desire to be picked up and moved to Broadway. Rosie O'Donnell. Okay, I've got it.
Oh my God.
Okay. So it came on, it ran for 2 years in London. And then Rosie O'Donnell, who was the famous New York US TV host, actress, comedian, saw it and wanted to bring it to Broadway.
Oh my God!
So she moved the production to Broadway, but with a new book written by Charles Bush, American artist, actor, most famously wrote a play called The Tale of the Allergist's Wife. So all these little nuggets about London and about the Taboo Club in London, which is where Boy George and all these crazy guys and girls houses was sort of adapted because they didn't think a Broadway audience was going to fully understand all of this. So she moved it into the Plymouth Theatre in New York, massive theatre to open this Broadway musical in. And of course, it opened and it didn't run for very long. It got terrible reviews. It was actually perceived as it was going to be the hit of the season. It opened in the same season as Wicked and Avenue Q. But actually, it didn't find traction. She brought Boy George over. They famously fell out together on the whole show at the time. And actually, the show became an unmitigated disaster. However, if that show had gone off Broadway, say into the theatre where Stomp plays, a little 400-seat theatre, somewhere like a Jane Street theatre, even if that was still there, where Hedwig had played, or a smaller house, and had built up that cult following, the step next to Broadway might have been a very, logical increment. Effectively, though, a lot of songs, as you rightly said, Aaron, if you dissect a U2 song, it is a thematic song that has an arc from beginning to end in what they want to say in that one number. The thing with the musical is, in a way, you have to ask the question always when you produce a musical, why do they need to stop speaking and start singing? And in a sense, and it's a really important note actually in musicals, because Otherwise, you could just might as well just do a play, just do the,
Right.
the lines. And so. So in a way, what you create is, if you're creating just a thematic song, you are not traveling the show. Now, in a strange way, that is a harking back, and maybe it was an influence to what they were listening with some of those old musicals. Because if you think on a lot of those musicals in the olden days, they used to come out with a bit of dialogue, sing "It's a Lovely Day" in, I don't know, Baltimore, and then actually but nothing would have moved from when the song began to when the song ended. It hadn't traveled.
Yeah.
If you think about the arrival of the through-sung musical, we began a linear traveling of the show. And in a way, that's really important. You've got to hit the ground, you've got to keep it running. Whereas actually with Spider-Man, it was quite enjoyable to watch, because it was like each time was a little vignette of a song, but it didn't really progress as much further from where we got from one point to the other. And,
Exactly.
and actually that reflected a lot in the U2 thematic structure of writing. And then it did get to a point, and no disrespect to any of the cast who I thought did a sterling job, but you did get to the point at the end of saying, well, if I'm just listening to this sort of YouTube music being played in this particular way inside the theatre, I could be going and watching a YouTube tribute act. Actually, in a way, because it was very odd, the original production, because they also put the guitarists on the wings playing.
Oh,
so
really?
you actually had these actors who weren't actors; they were actually musicians. So they actually made a feature of the guitarists playing on stage on the stage right and stage left sides.
No kidding.
Which was a bit of an odd decision, but it was one that they chose to do. I think, if I remember correctly, was it Reeve Carney? I think, who was the original? Well, I think it was one. I think one of them was his brother, actually, who was in the show, and it was a guitarist. And I have a feeling there was a connection with him also on the show.
Oh yeah, because they have they have a band or something like that.
Yeah, so there was an element of that. But okay, that's okay. But in the truth, you've got the idea that it's the Edge who's this great guitarist, and actually you're setting yourself up for a big fall, because how are you ever going to, no disrespect to any of them, how are you ever going to correct with that iconic image of what you're seeing? So in a way, I didn't get the logic of why that was there.
I always wondered why Disney didn't put more into The Hunchback of Notre Dame, because I love that musical. The music for that is just extraordinary, and such a departure from like the very family-friendly fare that they have been very well known for, with Ashman writing Aladdin and Beauty and the Beast and Little Mermaid. But I was just like, this seems like a no-brainer for Broadway, and it's kind of like appealing to more of a big book musical that has been written, kind of in the vein of Les Mis or something.
And it's interesting because Hunchback did have a production in Europe.
Right.
There was a production. And Paper Mill Playhouse did a production a few years ago, where there is now actually a recording in English that you can hear of the show. It is a surprise, but there's also a long-running French musical called Hunchback of Notre Dame, Notre Dame de Paris, which has played in arenas and stadiums across Europe. It came to London, and it actually had a run at the Dominion Theatre in sort of early 2000s, not very successfully, but it actually more recently came back in another revival at the very large Coliseum Theatre in London as part of a tour. And whether they suddenly thought they were in some competition, because this musical has been in the ether, and actually it's had productions in Korea and in Japan, and there's a number of different language cast recordings of that show available. So whether Disney just felt that it was, a market that had already been tapped, and Hunchback was therefore not a viable property to try and spend the money that it was looking at doing. I mean, they went off in the path of looking at things like doing Aida and those shows. And Aida's been interesting, because Aida's never been done in the UK or in London. It's had several successful productions in Europe. They've held that title away from the UK, which is surprising. I like a lot of Aida. I think a lot of Aida is actually a very, very good score. And again, it's a fantastic score with Tim Rice and Elton John, if I remember correctly, again on that collaboration. Yep.
As soon as I saw that Shrek was going to become a musical, I'm like, great. Now we're going to have about 8,000 shitty high school productions of Shrek. Yeah. Because if you're going to produce something, the scale that is intended in that script, you have to have the money to do it. Yeah. I, with Trident Theater, will never, knock on wood, will never be able to produce Frozen. Yeah. Because the space here doesn't exist. I would have to completely reinvent it somewhere. I would have to have a budget coming out my ears. I can't do it. So it's like, so what is that doing for the livelihood of the Broadway book musical?
Yeah, it's a huge problem. And I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, Shrek, I was a bit indifferent, but I didn't mind its original Broadway production. I felt it's not landed in other productions of it I've seen elsewhere. In fact, they it's actually where they tried to cut the cost back on it and actually realized that a lot of the expenditure of Shrek was what made it very, successful. But I mean, there was also lots of things. I mean, it was very well cast. Brian D'Arcy James and the original production
Sutton
things
Foster,
was Sutton Foster. It was a fantastic cast to kick the ground running.
Absolutely.
But it was interesting when those people started to leave. There wasn't the longevity of that show that sat in the same way that could carry it forwards, which was a valuable lesson to sit down and learn with it. I mean, with Frozen, it was interesting because Frozen didn't sustain the length of run that it perhaps would have expected for that title to have done on Broadway.
Yeah, exactly.
It did something, but it didn't succeed in the length that it needed to sit down and take, really. And in fact, Frozen is scheduled to open in August in London, and actually, I think it might run for longer in London, strangely, than it did do on Broadway, and just the event factor of what it contains and what it carries. But I do think that there is an interesting question about, effectively what they were trying to maybe make. I mean, if Spider-Man had gone in and been built as this sort of arena thing and had played this a massive season in Radio City Music Hall and had then gone off and toured extensively to larger arena type theatres in a Bono Edge kind of structure, which culminated in Las Vegas, that show probably would have been a very different entity. It might have also worked in a way. You have to remember one thing about Spider-Man, which is important, and we'll come on to that once it opens. But there is a particularly important point about Spider-Man when we talk about flops, which is that Spider-Man actually still retains, I think, or I don't know if anything's knocked it off, but it had done for a long time, and one might need to go back and double check this.
Oh, I think I know where you're going.
Best of my knowledge, the highest weekly gross of a musical of all time.
Yeah. And I think it was like $2 million gross in a week.
Its problem was its weekly running cost was so high that for any other show, if you dropped a bit, you could probably sustain that in recovery around it, maybe in other weeks or losses. But Spider-Man, if it did 700,000 when it was needing to do $1 million in a week, it was very fine line to just suddenly jeopardizing it very, very quickly. And when it peaked, of course, with its first season, but then its second season suddenly landing of new Broadway shows, it then really struggled to maintain its position, and that's where things started to get. And that's actually where they should have put a Gene Simmons and an Alice Cooper in if they'd wanted to keep it going. Because that actually would have given it its life on Broadway to compete with. And perhaps they didn't do that because maybe they did think this has got some Vegas legs maybe one day, and actually why do we want to throw our card down for a second cast and actually just hold that card out for when we want to play it in a big arena space inside Vegas or something.
I do want to go back to Frozen really quick. Our local roadhouse, the YO, that I work with quite a lot, has started this fun new YO Play initiative, and they took over a children's theater production company that has been in town for like 25 some years. And so this year they're doing Frozen Junior. And my younger son is a little bit more artistically inclined. He really enjoys musicals. We'll sit down and watch them quite often. I mean, he's 10, but Sweeney Todd is his favorite musical. He just loves it. And so when I presented him with the idea of doing this show that they do this summer, they're doing Frozen Junior. And my mother was with him at the time, and I said, hey, why don't you ask Ethan if he wants to do Frozen Junior? And let me see if I can find his comment, because it just cracked me up. He says he would definitely not like to do Frozen because it is disgusting and trash and should be removed from history.
Fair enough. Well, that's a bit straight to the point, but yeah, I guess he doesn't like it. It does say something, actually, isn't it?
Doesn't it?
I mean, it's actually interesting, because if you think about it, was quite a clever maneuver. I mean, it's totally different from thinking about Wicked. When Wicked did its run originally with Idina Menzel, and it was very interesting with that young generation of girls who went to see it with their mums. Right. How clever it was some years later when they did If Then, which was the musical that latterly came. Because actually what they realized was with Indina Menzel that a lot of those young girls who came through were now young
following
women,
her,
and actually they were following her.
Yep.
So of course it gave a hook of success for that musical to happen, because actually what it did was it could spiral. Now what it meant was that when Indina Menzel was to leave, that show really didn't necessarily have legs or a life beyond it. But it was quite an interesting marketing strategy that where, you know, you carry an audience forward, and actually you know that now they can come and they're just at a point where they're starting to date and they're, you know, maybe at college or university and things, and actually that musical would suddenly connect with them in that certain way. And indeed, if they had become mothers, they were perhaps also at the same time taking their daughters to see.
Right. And now it's a rite of passage. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
And there's an interesting question here, you see, Aaron, as well, which when you're looking at it, does the star matter? It arguably it doesn't necessarily, because in a way, unless you've got unless you've got Hugh Jackman that a young audience is perhaps going to know who are moviegoers, these musical names won't mean so much. The branded title still sticks in the same way as it is with Spider-Man. And in a way, it's such a strong branded title. Yeah. It's like in the same way as when you look at the Phantom of the Opera, it's such a strong brand. Now, it doesn't really matter who's playing the Phantom. The audience is coming because they associate the image and the identity. Right. You know, there's a few shows that can achieve that. And actually, that is the investor's dream. The investor's dream is where you can have a show where the brand becomes so strong that it doesn't actually matter. Look at Hamilton. You know, it doesn't matter who's playing Hamilton now. The brand is so strong, and that's an investor's dream. And Spider-Man, still to the investor, is a very attractive title because it doesn't necessarily suggest it needs a star to make that, because the star is a pretty big name in itself. Right. So, but
even at that time, that was such a trend on Broadway, especially in non-musicals. It's like, how can we get some big name actor out there? I remember, I think it was around this time when Scarlett Johansson was cast as what's her name, Margaret in A View from the Bridge. I mean, brilliant play, and no slight to Scarlett Johansson's acting, but you know, how are we going to be assured that she would be able to do that level of performance on Broadway? Oh, and then she got a Tony for it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a theory that there's always been stars in theatre, film stars doing theatre. I mean, Laurence Olivier, of course, stage star, film star, he was doing that. It's what's become interesting now is that actually it becomes frequently that there's a film star who has a window who can hop on and do something. And some of those have come with far more mixed results than others. I mean, you know, Julia Roberts, as a case in point, in 3 Days of Rain, was disappointing in that production, but she sold out the house because it was Julia Roberts. Right. And there's certain names of it. Conversely, you know, Sean Combs, Puff Daddy, in Raisin in the Sun, was absolutely fantastic in that production. So, you know, it really depends on marriage with the vehicle and the right show. But what we are interesting zone in now is that you've got actors who predominantly can commit to 16 weeks in a run. You're not talking about how those actors who once used to come on and maybe commit to a year or 10 months in a show. We're talking about very short hits. Yeah, and that's actually also another factor on Broadway and West End commercial producing. There is, and particularly in drama, there's not a belief any longer that a play can necessarily run. You know, if you look back on plays when they opened, if you had Woman in Black now, which has been played many years in the West End, if it was coming to, I think it's the West End's longest running play, or sort of, the Mousetrap was probably its second longest running play. If Woman in Black was arriving right now as a play to be produced, it would be given probably a 12 to 16 week window in a West End theatre with another show booked in after it. There wouldn't be the belief that shows which they used to be able to do could recast and keep running. If you look at drama so often now, it just goes straight in as a short flash from the pan hit. And then it doesn't have that longevity of extension, and that's a really big change and not actually necessarily a terribly good one. You know, the ability to recast and long running plays has really affected the dichotomy of a lot of drama getting onto commercial stages.
Right. Yeah.
always remember the Aspects of Love preview in London in 1989. And that was very complicated because they'd had a very checkered time getting that show on. Roger Moore, a.k.a. 007, was due to play George in that role, the older man in that show, big lead role, and had decided in the end that he was going to leave because vocally he just couldn't sing it. So but he'd been in rehearsal. He just suddenly at one point decided it wasn't working and he was going to leave. So they had to bring in another, well, actually his understudy, a wonderful actor called Kevin Colson, who'd also had a quite distinguished West End career, moved up to take that role. But they obviously had now a lot of delay because it required a lot of changes. The problem they had in this preview period was they had a royal gala performance that was scheduled in the preview period, which of course meant that they had to go ahead and do this performance because it was a scheduled performance. So although everything was delayed and suspended, they had one gap where there was no shows either side, but this Royal Gala performance had to happen. So the Royal Gala performance went ahead, which was effectively the first preview, only for other shows to have. There was one point in it which was interesting in that particular show, and I never saw it, but I had someone who was working on it who was telling me about this one particular show, because in the show, in Aspects of Love on Broadway, in the West End, a wonderful production designed by Maria Ben-Jawson, who designed the set for the Phantom of the Opera. It was her next show after that. Ben-Jawson, fantastic designer who sadly passed away far too young, but the Aspects of Love design was amazing. But there was a song in it in the start of the first act, after Love Changes Everything. There's a sequence where Alex, the young lover, falls in love with the actress, and they make an escape to George's sort of chateau in France, and they go in a car and they get into this car and they sing the song. And the next trick was that the car, the end of the number, went upwards into the flies, which was how the piece of scenery exited. Yeah. They exited from a bridge, and then basically the car in the mechanics in the flies tilted vertically, drove along the rig, and then moved backwards, and that was how it was stored, because the wings of the Prince of Wales Theatre aren't very easy to manipulate. So this piece of technical equipment had to be the first piece of equipment to go in on the load-in or the getting into the theatre, so it could fix into the grid. So on this first performance of this happening, they did this sequence, and as the car went upwards, the car accidentally tilted backwards through the two actors, which made Michael Ball, who was playing the role of Alex, a British actor, suddenly yell out in almost swear in shock, because he thought he was about to be flipped out of the car. And it went upwards into the bridge, and they exited. But it was decided that wasn't liked, and it was only ever seen on that one performance. Now, for the rest of the run, because it was the first piece of scenery that had to go in, and it ran for about 4 years at the Prince of Wales Theatre, that car stayed suspended above the stage for the entire run. It was never used again in a single performance.
Oh, my God.
So this one Royal Gala performance that segued between rehearsals, because when the Royal Gala ended, they went back into rehearsal again because they just had to do this one performance. This expensive piece of scenery just sat there for the rest of the time. And then, of course, that one preview went out of the way. And then some weeks later, they went back into the first preview run and eventually opened. If it had been today that had happened, well, of course, the Twitter and the social media would have gone mad. And actually, the show probably would have been lambasted about how a disaster it was and everything. And would it have recovered from that? Would it have actually gone on to sustain the run that it actually did enjoy in the West End and has been revived since? It happens on shows of all scales. I can remember very early on when I worked in theatre management in a regional theatre, we used to take sometimes Saturday morning shows coming in and playing, over the top of something else. And I remember at one point we had the Mr. Men come. And I don't know if you know the Mr. Men, but you've got Mr. Happy and Mr. Bump and Mr. Tickle and all this stuff. And this was basically a show which was produced by a producer who, let's just say, was somewhat, unscrupulous as a producer, I would suspect. He was probably the sort of producer you'd shake his hand and want to count how many fingers you'd walk away with afterwards. But anyway, he was producing his Saturday morning show, and all I can remember on this particular performance was that Mr. Bump, because they all had great big velvet sort of costumes, they sort of wall-on dance these dancers wearing, but they were quite hard to see out of. And unfortunately, Mr. Bump and Mr. Happy had a collision which involved Mr. Happy falling into the orchestra pit, and Mr. Happy unfortunately broke his leg, or her leg, because it was a female dancer. And all I can remember is the ambulance these kids, the show stopping with these sort of 10-year-old and 8-year-old kids all looking anxiously over the orchestra pit down at Mr. Happy Live down there, with the ambulance crew turning up, and the producer standing down at the front in a paddock saying, "Don't cut the costume because I need it because we're in Canterbury tomorrow." And I thought, well, there you go. That sort of sums it up. That was like welcome to the theatre. If you think about when Cats came along, they couldn't raise the money for Cats at all.
Right.
To such an extent that at one point Cameron Mackintosh asked the cast if they could go away and find out if they knew anyone who had any money. Lloyd Webber remortgaged his house twice. They put it into a theatre that was the New London, which in those days was a white elephant. Trevor Nunn, who now is a very successful musical theatre director, had not directed a commercial musical before. The show was an idea of T.S. Eliot's poems with Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical, actors dancing around playing cats for an evening. How the heck do you sell that? I mean, when you think about it, how the heck do you sell that in a theatre that's been a white elephant, which has been a TV studio for years and actually hasn't been used as a theatre? They then end up with Judi Dench in the cast. Great piece of cast. Who was going to be the original Grisabella, who in rehearsals cracks her Achilles tendon, so she's out of the show and can't open it.
God.
Luckily, Elaine Page, who'd come off Evita, was available, so she could slot in with not much rehearsal. The opening performances of previews get underway, and on the opening night of the show, still without it being fully capitalized, they have a bomb scare at the theatre. So the theatre evacuate on its opening night, and they go back in for Act 2. And the audience is so electric because they've not seen something like that on the stage before. The reviews are so phenomenal. The show runs for 21 years. Simplest thing can be absolutely amazing if you get the stagecraft and the trick right. With
right.
It. And
yes, exactly.
It's actually all, again, like with any musical or any play. You can have the question. It's all in the storytelling. And it's all in the structure of script and book. And if you've got that, and you've got an audience who's coming with imagination, you can really play with. And that's the joy of stagecraft. I mean, if you can get it right and how you deliver it, it's about, isn't it, that ability to tell a story. And that's in any sense. If you take it in a completely non-magical sense, but you take Oklahoma and you listen to the first chords of Oklahoma that get played. Right. Those first chords are so important because how do you score a sunrise? Well, I think Richard Rodgers does it like a piece of genius in Oklahoma. And those bars are so important because it wouldn't matter then if the stage was completely black and you just had one spotlight. The music has taken you to that place. It sets it up because it punctuates it so beautifully. We're placed just on those notes. And then, of course, Curly comes out and sings those opening lines. It doesn't matter whether we're sitting in New York, in Oklahoma, in Norwich in England, in Johannesburg, wherever we are watching that show, we are placed in that show immediately because the book and music have perfectly fused together and given us that stage placement. And actually what's happened is it doesn't matter with any of the effects around it. It's actually the music has basically given the grounding to that actor to come on and say, this is where we are, the confidence of it, that the actor can come out and attack, and then he can tell you the story. And if you can't root it into that ability of the storytelling first, and if the book doesn't work, where you can not tell this story without any of the effects that are attached to it, if that's not working, then there's an intrinsic problem with the show.
Well, my friends, that is it for today's episode. I hope you appreciated that. Richard has so much stuff to talk about, and we got into a lot of really wonderful conversations. I know that I will have him on the show again sometime in the future, but for now, this is Aaron Odom from Trident Theater in Sheridan, Wyoming, signing off for another episode of Euripides Eumenides, a theater history podcast. Hope to see you again in 2 weeks, and I will see you at intermission.